It is a cold December evening in 1773. The streets of Boston literally sleep, while the waters of the harbor gently lap up and down against the wooden docks, their shadows dancing beneath a thin veil of moonlight. Behind closed doors, though, the city teems alive with quiet, simmering rage. Men are gathered in secrecy, their faces lit by flickering lanterns, their voices low yet resolved. The weight of the air carries something monumental waiting to happen. This is not any night in Boston. This is the eve of a defiance that shall echo down the ages of history. Something is brewing, and it certainly isn't just tea. When we think of the Boston Tea Party, our minds often leap to a single image: a group of men, disguised as Mohawk Indians, defiantly pitching cases of tea into the harbor. As vivid and indelible as this image is, it barely scratches the surface of what actually transpired. What if I told you that this iconic act of rebellion wasn't as spontaneous as it's often portrayed? Behind the symbolic theatrics, months of detailed planning, political strategy, and even personal rivalries were repressed. And what if I told you that the story we know, the one taught at classrooms and immortalized in textbooks, was actually a cleaned-up version of a rather complex truth? In order to understand the Boston Tea Party, we have to step back, not just to 1773, but to decades earlier, to a world where tea wasn't just a drink, but a symbol of power, wealth, and empire. By the mid-18th century, tea had become the lifeblood of British commerce. The trade was dominated by the East India Company, a sprawling multinational corporation with its own private army, which made obscene profits from the leaves plucked in the plantations of India and China. To the British elite, tea was a great deal more than a drink. It was ritual, status symbol, and a manifestation of global dominance, the triumph of empire and spoils of exploitation. But within the American colonies, tea was another thing altogether. A luxury, certainly, but it was also connected to a motherland that many a colonist increasingly resented. For years, the British Parliament had imposed taxes on colonial goods, from sugar to paper, in the name of raising revenue to defray the costs of empire. The Stamp Act of 1765, the Townshend Acts of 1767, each new law drove a wedge further between the colonies and the crown. And yet, by 1773, it wasn't so much the taxes that outraged the colonists as the principle driving them, a profound question of rights and representation. No taxation without representation. It is a phrase grown almost trite, but in 1773, quite revolutionary. These colonists were not just disgruntled about having to pay taxes, but they were angry that they had to pay taxes by a government for which they had no representative voice. And tea, in its dualities of a luxury and as a commodity being taxed, is where the lightning rods of their discontent finally fell upon. It would serve as that spark to make a latent discontent boil out to the surface, joining various dislocated groups together under one popular banner. The tensions between the colonists and British rule in the port city of Boston, however, had reached an apex since the autumn of 1773. The focal point of controversy was the Tea Act, passed earlier that year. It was harmless enough on its face. The law allowed the East India Company to sell its surplus tea directly to the colonies, thus eliminating middlemen and, by the same token, lowering the price. To the colonists, however, it was a Trojan horse. To accept the tea was silently to acknowledge that Parliament had a right to tax them. It was not an act about cheap tea, it was about control, an assertive stroke of the British government against the colonies. Enter Samuel Adams, the fiery orator, master propagandist. Adams was not a leader, but he was a tactician who understood with full force the power of symbolism and spectacle. When 3 ships carrying East India Company tea, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, arrived in Boston Harbor at the end of November, Adams seized his chance. For weeks, he and his fellow radicals in the Sons of Liberty concertedly managed a campaign of resistance, orchestrating town meetings, rallying support, and issuing ultimatums to the ship's captains: leave the harbor, or else. It was a game of high-stakes brinkmanship, with each side testing the other's resolve. But here's the kicker. The captains couldn't just turn their ships around. The law said the tea had to be unloaded within 20 days of arrival, or it could be seized by customs officials. If the tea were unloaded, however, it would be taxed and the colonists would forfeit the moral high ground. The standoff was preposterous, more a political chess game in which each side would wait for the other to blink. With each passing day, the prospect of the looming deadline mounted with rising stakes. As the deadline approached, tension mounted. Governor Thomas Hutchinson, a staunch loyalist, would not allow the ships to leave without the duty being paid on their cargo. Meanwhile, the colonists became desperate in their quest to have the tea not unloaded. Thus, the standoff reached an explosive conclusion on the night of December 16, 1773. The moment was years in making. Frustration, defiance, and the want of freedom all combined. It was put forth that members who participated in the Boston Tea Party put on the attire of Mohawk Indians for camouflage to mask their identity. Well, that might be correct, but it isn't all the truth. Not only were the disguises functional, but they also had symbolic value borrowed from the idea of breaking free from British rule and forging a new, uniquely American identity. But let's be clear, this was not an act done on the spur of the moment. The people who boarded the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver that night were organized and disciplined. They split into teams, with each man having an assignment. Some men wielded hatchets to break open the tea chests, while others made sure every last leaf made it into the harbor. It was organized rebellion, not chaotic riot. For hours, the harbor was a flurry of activity. They worked with speed and efficiency, dumping over 300 chests of tea worth an estimated 10,000 pounds, or roughly $1.7 million today, into icy waters. Onlookers described the scene as strangely orderly, even quiet, with little shouting or chaos to speak of. One man who tried to pocket a bit of tea for himself was immediately scolded, a testament to the group's strict code of conduct. It was at the same time both deliberate and disciplined, a statement of principle carried out with precision. But here is a detail not often remembered. The aftermath, the day after, in fact. Boston woke to find a city on edge. The defiance intoxicating surely was also deeply perilous, and many who had participated harbored fear of retaliation, both from British hands and from among their own. The secrecy was utmost. Even years later, some of the participants would not openly confirm their involvement in the incident. It was a bold move, but rather an action filled with possible repercussions. And what was the British response? Fast and brutal. The Boston Tea Party directly challenged the British authority, and Parliament was not to show any mercy. In early 1774, they passed what was called the Coercive Acts in the colonies, the Intolerable Acts, which included measures like the closing of Boston Harbor and the revocation of the Massachusetts Charter. They little subdued the rebellion, but fanned the flames, galvanizing colonial resistance and setting up the stage for the American Revolution. All this miscalculation of the British ultimately gave the colonists more strength in their resolution to unite and fight for their independence. Now, here comes the interesting part, that the Boston Tea Party was not wholly championed when it had taken place. While to many colonists it was a bold stroke for liberty, many people regarded it as a rash, unnecessary act. Some merchants worried about economic repercussions. Moderates feared such radical actions would alienate potential allies in Britain. Even John Adams, Samuel's cousin and fellow patriot, had mixed feelings about the event, calling it so bold, so daring, so firm, yet wondering if it was quite so wise. It was an event as divisive as it was inspiring. What of the tea itself? Actually, the colonists were not protesting the price of the tea. Actually, due to the Tea Act, British tea was cheaper than the smuggled Dutch tea, which most colonists preferred. The issue was not economic, it was ideological. The colonists didn't want to be told what to drink or who to buy it from. By dumping the tea, they weren't just rejecting a commodity, they were rejecting an entire system of control. It was a statement of independence, a statement of the right to self-government. Fast-track to today, the Boston Tea Party has become an anchor in American mythology, a symbol of rebellion and self-determination. The reality, though, is considerably more complex. It was an act of defiance, yes, but also a calculated gamble, a moment of high-stakes theater designed to send a message to the British and to the colonies, a reminder that history is never quite as black and white as it seems. nor its iconic moments as free of motives, conflicts, and repercussions. So the next time you hear anyone mention the Boston Tea Party, remember one thing. It was not about the tea at all. It was all about power and identity and what common people are willing to go through in their quest to believe in an ideal. Messy, incendiary, risky, but an ember to help the revolution begin.